we're going to talk about shoreline armor now. And to start with, let's just see some images of what that means. When we say armor, we're talking about areas that might have a rock wall or a timber bulkhead, or maybe a poured concrete bulkhead, or perhaps just some old tires were used to protect the bank and try to slow erosion. And so that's what we're referring to when we say shoreline armor. Sure, I see a note that I'm hard to hear. Is that better? Okay. So Mason County has over 150 miles of shoreline. That's like the third longest amount of shoreline in the Puget Sound, and nearly 60% of those parcels are armored. So armor is something that many shoreline homeowners are dealing with here in Mason County. So as we saw before on a whole Puget Sound scale, here's the change in shoreline armor in Mason County. And you can see that over time, the amount of new armor that's being installed is decreasing, but we still have quite a bit of replacement happening. And then there have been a few bulkhead removal projects happening in recent history as well. So as the shorelines of Mason County were developed, it seemed like it was kind of just part of building on the shoreline. People thought, well, I need to put in a bulkhead, or they would put a bulkhead down on the beach a little ways and push the soil back behind it to create a little bit larger lawn. And then maybe they wanted to build somewhere in a really narrow spot along Highway 101, and would build a bulkhead and then build a house on it. So many of the properties have bulkheads that are in unfortunate locations because they're really impacting the shoreline. And consequently, they're dealing with difficulties with managing those bulkheads because the footings are undermined and that sort of thing. And so bulkhead might not be the best way to protect your resources, but in some instances it's all we can do because of where the houses are placed. So we will move forward here and see what's next. So the challenge that shoreline armor addresses is often designed to address erosion. There's lots of different kinds of erosion that we'll discuss today, and so sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. People are trying to, or the challenge that it presents is it can also create additional loss of beaches, and then it also impairs natural processes and habitats. So let's look at each of those in detail. So erosions, bulkheads don't necessarily address the root cause of erosion. So we'll look at those different types of erosion, and sometimes it can aggravate erosion, and we've got some images to show what that looks like. So here's the transport zone that we looked at earlier, and you can see there's a bulkhead there along the shoreline, and there's an example of a bulkhead that's placed further out onto the beach than just where the high tide stops. So one thing that can happen with bulkheads is that if the drainage is impeded at all, water can build up behind the bulkhead and cause hydrostatic pressure to build, and bulkheads can topple. And so sometimes you'll see bulkheads leaning, the top is leaning out a bit. That's usually from hydrostatic pressure, and then the soils on the slope moving down and pushing on the bulkhead. So you can see in this little inset picture that they had a lot of groundwater buildup and pressure from that, and a slope failure. Another way that bulkheads increase erosion is that the hard surface addresses the waves differently. If the shoreline has no bulkhead on it, the wave energy is dissipated in the small sediments that often accumulate at the top of the beach. And when there's hard armor, the waves are reflected back, and that action, when they're moving back down the beach with more force, pulls sediment with it down the beach and begins to expose the footings on the bulkhead, which is demonstrated in that image there, which leads to failure over time, and also changes the size of the substrate on the beach. So you might notice on some beaches where 20, 40 years ago, you remember having a lot of sand and nice material to walk on barefoot, and now it's reduced to cobble because there hasn't been material replaced due to the bulkheads. Another type of erosion you might see is end erosion, which happens when you have a long stretch of bulkhead and then you run into a parcel that doesn't have any shoreline armoring. You'll see wave erosion that happens around the end of the bulkhead and removes some sediment or material from behind it. And so that can often be exaggerated in those areas at the ends of armor. So you may see the slope of the beach increase and the amount of sediment on the beach decrease over time in front of bulkheads. So beach loss is the other thing we're looking at, or the next. So ways that bulkheads can impair natural processes and reduce habitat. The sediment that would normally be eroding slowly from the bank is stopped by the bulkhead. And so as that transport zone moves sediment down the beach, it doesn't have any source to replace that sediment in that area. So a reduction of supply. The other thing that can happen is that the upper beach, where the high tide deposits organic material that is used to feed all the little critters that live on the upper beach and feed the fish and such, doesn't have a place to be deposited. So you don't have that natural cycle of organic matter resting in the rack line at the top of the beach. And large wood also doesn't accumulate when there's bulkheads often because the water floats the wood away. So our beaches have a lot less driftwood than they used to. In addition, creosote-treated pilings contribute toxins to the water that have been documented to inhibit the hatching of forage fish eggs and cause problems for other marine critters. So toxins can be presented. And then one of the really notable characteristics of a Puget Sound shoreline in its natural state is overhanging vegetation, and that's really important for creating good habitat for the fish that travel at high tides along the shoreline and dropping insects and detritus into the water to feed those animals. So bulkheads often reduce the amount of overhead vegetation that you'll see on our shorelines. And then forage fish, we've been talking a lot about them today, and that is one of the big drivers of looking for bulkhead removal opportunities is creating additional forage fish habitat, because the bulkheads inhibit or reduce the amount of upper beach that's available. That's the location where herring and surf smelt spawn, and they need that fine material up high on the beach with overhanging shade to be able to have a viable reproductive cycle. So here's some images of those little surf smelt herring and sand lance that we were talking about earlier, the forage fish, and they're kind of a bottleneck in the food chain. They're really important for feeding those larger marine animals that live in the Puget Sound. And here's just a little diagram that kind of shows how bulkheads reduce the amount of forage fish spawning habitat that's available. You can see on the natural shoreline, the potential for the upper beach to develop as sea level changes is there, but when the bulkhead is there, the amount of area that's available is reduced. So bulkheads are a challenge, but they're also an opportunity for you folks as shoreline homeowners. They're a great way, and we're here to kind of help you look at your specific site and look for opportunities for you to help with stewardship and also address the concerns that you have. So understanding why erosion is important, and we'll go through the different types of erosion next. But oftentimes, natural approaches to managing shorelines are the easiest, most sustainable, and most cost-effective. So what if you're considering replacing your bulkhead or adding new armor? Some of the things that will help you look at are, what are the costs? Are there other ways that you could address the issues that you're seeing along your shoreline, like managing vegetation and drainage? If some sort of protection of the bank is important, are there some soft shore alternatives that might work for you? And then, what are the natural erosion rates on your bank, and should maybe the structure is actually too close to the edge, and we need to look at ways to maybe move the structure back. So we're here to help, and we're here to kind of come look at your site-specific issues with you. But this presentation should be an overview of some of the things we'll be looking at. So what if you're just gung-ho to take your bulkhead out? Well, what we recommend is just give us a call, and we'd love to come out for a site visit and talk to you about whether that's a feasible idea or not.